Hey everybody, thanks for tuning back into OTRAM's YouTube channel. Today we're doing an ARB air locker in the front axle of a 100 series Land Cruiser. So we've got the front differential out on the bench. I've already run it through the parts washer once just to get all the road grime and everything off. So when we take the cover off, we don't get any more dirt inside than we absolutely have to. So we can go ahead and take the cover off first. And it's just 14 millimeter socket. And I forgot to grab my extension. Let me go grab that so I can get that bottom bolt. And then on these, there's one more bolt from the back side. So set that off to the side. Come on. And then there's a couple of lugs to pry against. And it helps if you get all the bolts. There we go. So now we've got our housing open. We can set this off to the side. And we can take our extension tube off, just to get that out of our way and make it easier to move the diff around. Come on. Most of the time that'll just pop free once you've got all the bolts out. This one's not wanting to cooperate. So I'm gonna go grab my brass hammer. There we go. We can set this guy off to the side. Now we can go ahead and measure our backlash so we've got a reference when we're putting everything back together. Come on. Swing that around and zoom you in real quick. Oop, too far. And we're right at about 8 thousandths. So we'll write that down and note that for later. Go ahead and set this off to the side for now. So I'll write myself a note about the backlash up there. And then we're going to mark the bearing caps just with a center punch. We'll do 3 dots on this side. Now I'll just do 4 over here. That way we can keep straight where our bearing caps go. And go ahead and take those out. go, we've got that guy out. Now we can just come in through one of the windows. Well, came most of the way out. Come on. There we go. And then I'm going to make a ring gear side note and a pinion side note. And I'm going to put the bearing cap and the shim from the ring gear side over there and from the pinion side over here. That way we can keep those straight. I'm going to go ahead and put the center section back in the parts washer to get it cleaned up before I pull the ring gear off. And I'm going to put the housing here back in the parts washer to get a lot of the rest of the gear oil out, so when we drill, nothing stays in there. And we'll go ahead and do the cover too. These will end up making a couple of trips through the parts washer. We'll get the big stuff out, and then I'll come back and strip all the old sealer off, wash it again. You can never have diff parts too clean. So let me get these all cleaned up, and I'll bring you back when we start measuring everything. Okay, so we've got our parts back out of the parts washer again. So now they're not all greasy, grimy, gross. So we can start taking the carrier bearings off so we can swap them over to the new air locker. And I've just got our carrier bearing puller on here. We'll pop this one off. And that one came off the pinion side, so we'll stick that over in the pinion bearing pile. Or the pinion side pile of the, yeah. You know where I'm going for. And there we go. Make sure we're seated right. Stick that in the other pile. Put this off to the side. Now we can start taking all the ring gear bolts out of here so we can get the ring off. And there's these locking tabs that are bent up and over, so we just got to take a chisel, knock them down. we go. And where'd we put our 17? I had the socket here. Ah, there it is. So we just take our 17. And we can answer the phone. Okay, so we got all our bolts out. Now we can just put a punch down the bolt holes and kind of work our way around. There we go. We can set this guy aside. We'll do some measurements in a little bit to figure up our thin shim thicknesses, but right now it's still hot from coming out of the parts washer, so we're going to give that a little bit of time to come back down to room temperature so we can measure that. We'll wipe off the back of our ring gear here, and let me grab my oil stone. We're just going to take the oil stone and just lightly polish over the back side of the ring just to look and make sure there's no high spots, no dings that would keep it from sitting flush and running out of true on the new air locker. And that looks good. So I'm going to go stick this back in the parts washer so it can get cleaned up again before we actually drop it on. And then while we're waiting for the carrier to cool down, move my pig mat, we can go ahead and start prepping the housing. There's a little tab up here in the corner. It's probably hard to see on the camera, but it's the only flat tab that comes out in the differential. We need to drill that to take a zip tie to help support the airline. So we're going to go ahead and drill pilot hole. There we go. And I forgot to grab a bigger drill bit. We'll just finish that off with a 1/4-inch drill bit so we can get a zip tie through there. And then we'll put this back in the parts washer again to get all the shavings and everything out. And you can see we already went around the sealing surface with just a wire brush and a carbide scraper to get all the sealer off, to make it clean to put the new sealer on. So go ahead and put this in the parts washer. And then we can come back to our housing cover, and the ARB instructions show us putting a hole right about here, and we're going to drill that. First we're going to pilot it. We'll pilot that with an 1/8 inch. Then we'll come back with a quarter. And then we'll come back and enlarge that to 7/16 so we can tap that with a 1/4 inch pipe tap. There we go. And then I'll come back and just tap that to 1/4 inch pipe thread off camera. And then I'll put this through the parts washer again. And that way everything's clean. And once everything's back to room temperature, we'll come back and measure everything for our shim packs. Okay, so now we're to the point of actually needing to do math. We've got to measure from the shoulder of this bearing race down to the ring gear mounting surface. And the easiest way I've found to do that is to use an engine straight edge, and you can lay the straight edge across that bearing race and drop some bolts on the floor. And then you can hold that steady and then use your digital calipers or dial calipers to measure between the ring gear face and the straight edge. And I take a couple of measurements around the ring just to make sure that I'm getting the same measurement everywhere. And you also want to make sure that you measure on this side and on this side just to make sure that you're holding the straight edge square to the shoulder there. And then you'll just go do the same thing on the air locker. I already measured these off camera because it's really awkward to hold everything and take measurements. And we lucked out. Both of these measure 91.98 millimeters from the shoulder to the ring surface. So we can actually use the factory shim that came off. If they didn't measure the same, there's a set of formulas in the ARB instructions for calculating out a new shim thickness that will set your backlash proper. But anyway, we lucked out. The measurements are the same, so we can just use the factory shim. So now that that's done, I'm going to go put the ARB housing in the freezer to shrink it, and I'm going to put the ring gear in the warming oven to expand it slightly so that we can drop them together real easily. So once that's done, I'll bring you back and we'll put the ring gear on. Okay, off camera, I went ahead and put the ring gear on the new ARB carrier, just clamped it in the press, cross-torqued all the ring gear bolts to 71 foot-pounds with red Loctite on them, and then I've already pressed the bearings back on as well because I've got plenty of videos that show pressing bearings and bolting up ring gears. So now we're ready to stick this back in the housing so we can measure our ring gear side shims to set preload. So what we're going to do is take the air housing and set it on this side. I don't have the O-rings in here yet just because I don't want a chance dinging them. We're going to carefully slide this guy back in. And then we're going to take our factory shim from the pinion side and slide that in. If yours wasn't a match distance-wise, you'd be putting in the shim pack you made up with the ARB instructions. And then we're just going to take a feeler gauge between the back side of that seal housing and the differential housing. And you kind of want to just rock everything and get it seated. And I already stuck this in here once and came up and got 0.584 millimeters is my just snug fit. So we can pop this back out, being careful with our air housing. We can set the shim and the carrier off to the side, or the race off rather. I'm going to go ahead and lube up the bearings, or the O-rings. So we'll be ready to stick that on, and then we can calculate up the shim pack that goes in here. So let me dig the O-rings out, and we'll set those up and come back. So what I like to do to make sure the O-rings are well lubed, they come in this little Ziploc bag. I just put a bunch of gear oil in there and just kind of squish them around some to get them good and lubricated. We'll take the air housing off. And we can fish one of the O-rings out. And these, I don't know if you can see it, but they're actually square. They're not a round cross section. And I've already cleaned out the inside of the housing and the grooves. And then we're just gonna easy work this in, making sure that we don't twist it. And the easiest way I've found to keep them from twisting, as you work them around, you'll get them most of the way in, and then flip the excess inwards so it makes a W, and then you can work that W down in there, and that'll help keep it from twisting as it goes in. And then just give them a good look over. Make sure it's in there straight, no twists, no dirt or anything on them. And then we're going to go ahead and lube that seal surface as well. Wipe off our hands. And then I've already looked up the dimensions, but I have to remember them. When we're doing the preload, it wants us to add 0.06 to 0.09 millimeters to our feeler gauge dimension, which when you add 0.06 to it, you get 0.644. So I made up a shim stack that's 0.644. Actually, I think it's 0.69. That was the closest I could get with the supplied shims, but that's still within the variance that Toyota gives for preload. So we'll stick the shims. You can see they go on a step here. And we'll slowly twist and work these guys down onto the locker housing. You want to be real careful at this part because you don't want to twist or cut one of these O-rings because you get to pull it all back apart again if you do. So there, we've got that on there. And we can take it and flip it upright, and we're going to put the bearing race from the pinion side back on, but not that shim yet. And then we'll stick this in the carrier. And I kind of want that airline sticking more my way. Something about like that, maybe. Actually, I want that because we want to come around this bottom. So I'm going to straighten that out some carefully and roll that down so it's pointing more in the direction I need it to end up. Now we can take our factory shim and wiggle it in over here. And the Toyota instructions are that you want to be able to put this in most of the way by hand, and then you'll know that your preload's pretty close. And then just tap it the rest of the way in with a plastic hammer. Let me go grab my hammer. There we go. I'm actually going to grab a brass drift to knock that the rest of the way in. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and stick the bearing caps back in. So we just need to match up our marks from where we took them apart. And this side's a little bit snug with that line. You just want to make sure you don't mess up that copper line, whatever you do. And it seems that I put my, I had a 3/8 drive out. It seems I put that away prematurely. Let me go grab that. That'll make it easier. And for right now, I'm just going to lightly snug these just to get everything seated in the bore. That up. And we got a measurement slightly wrong somewhere. We're a bit tight on backlash. So I'm going to have to add a little bit to this side shim and subtract a little bit from our preload shim to move the ring gear that way slightly. So I'll do that off camera, bounce around until I get a dimension that's right. Preload feels good. We're just a little bit tight on backlash. So let me do that and we'll come back. Okay, so what I ended up doing, the original shim that came from this side was a little bit thicker than the factory shim that we took out of here. I swapped this side shim, the original shim, to this side, and I took out a corresponding amount of shim thickness from under the bearing cap. And that worked out to getting us right on with 0.08 of backlash. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this. Probably not. But we're getting 7.5, 0.08 of backlash on there now. So now we're happy. And when I checked that a few minutes ago, I did have the bolts in here, tightening it all up. So now that we've got that squared away, I've got my bearing caps back in. So we can put some Loctite on these bolts since they're not coming back out again. I've already run my copper line down around behind the bearing cap. A little more on here. And then these torque, and I just totally lost it. $63 foot-pounds. And where'd it go? I just had my big pry bar out. So we're going to cheat. We're going to stick our big bar in the side there to give us a counter. While we torque these up. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and witness mark them with a paint pen. There we go. I'm going to start prepping my airline. I got to find a zip tie that'll go in there, and I'll start messing with that. Let me get that set up, and I'll bring you back. Okay, so ARB's instructions have you route the copper line down here, and then put a zip tie through that hole we drilled earlier, and then you kind of roughly route it so it points out over here. And then you can take your diff cover, slide it on there, and then spin this around a little bit. I'm just going to lightly hold it up there. Mark this line about 5/16 outside of this hole. So we've got that done. We can go ahead and take our brake line tubing cutter. And zip that off to length. I don't think I need new wheels in the tubing cutter. There we go. I can stick that back through there. And that is not the right bolt. We're just going to lightly put 2 of the cover bolts in for now to hold that in position. And I walked over here without sealer, so let me grab some sealer for this fitting. And I left the end on the sealer again, and it hardened up. So we get to fish that out. Or we can just grab the tube Crash brought us that's already fished out. We're going to put a little bit of sealer on there. We use the Toyota Transpan gear oil sealer. We'll fish that around our copper line. Thread that in. Of course, for a fitting that I've already checked that it fits in well, doesn't want to start now that that line's pressing crooked on it. Let me fiddle with that, and then we'll come back. It's in the boxes. Okay, that's a little bit better. I just didn't want to start with the copper line already pressing into it. So we've got those loosely on there. Now we can dig up the rest of our bulkhead fitting parts. We can take this small little rubber O-ring, not the brass piece, and stick that over the end of the copper line. Always so much fun to get on there. There we go. And then we're going to put the brass spacer on. This is the first time I've stuck the new bulkhead assembly ARBs got together. The last set of these that came through were the old school blue line. There we go, work that down in there. And then second small O-ring. Which we seem to be missing. So we'll grab it out of this other kit for now. Stick that guy in there. And then we'll gently squish it down. And then there's this new Phillips retainer that goes in there. Let me go grab my screwdriver for that. I'm gonna have to straighten that copper line out from the inside, so I'll bring you back. That doesn't want to start straight. Okay, so it took a little bit of tweaking, but I finally got that center retainer down in there. My copper line was just a little bit crooked sideways, and it was keeping that line, or the compression nut, to start straight, and it was wanting to cross thread this housing. So it's in there, it's clamped. Now all we've got left to do is to actually leak check, hook some compressed air up, make sure our O-rings are sealed well before we finalize putting the cover on. I have the leak checker for the old blue line style fittings. I haven't made one for this new swivel bulkhead yet. So I'm gonna go ahead and make one of those off camera and leak check these. But that's the basics for putting the ARB in. All that's left to do is assemble the swivel onto here, and then we're going to lightly move this back out, clean inside between the flanges real well, and use some sealer to glue this front cover back on, as well as this extension housing tube. But that's pretty standard, so you probably don't want to waste time watching me do it on a video. And then we'll just throw it back in the truck. Anyway, that's installing ARB air locker in the front differential of a 100 series Land Cruiser. Hope you thought it was interesting. If you did, please subscribe below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.